Two of our distinguished guests will be here momentarily, and then we can get started. Thanks for taking the pause.
No, the chair. See, on the chair, my things are lying. Jacket.
だからちょっと別に何でもいいんだけど、確認してくれってことなんで。Now we have to go. Yeah, okay. Good. Let's go. これじゃあちょっとここ出ていいよね。
Yep. Admiral, please. You are currently with the, remind me again.
India Foundation.
India Foundation. President?
No, on the board of trustees.
Board of Trustees. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. How are all of you? I hope that you are as pleased as I am that we decided to do this event today and not tomorrow. As you know, the weather is supposed to take an inclement turn, so I like to think that that other forces are at work that explain why we have a chilly but very clear day for the event today. And I want to thank all of you for coming out for what is, as you can see, an overflow crowd, which is always a great pleasure for us here at Hudson Institute. By the way, I'm Arthur Herman, the Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our very distinguished panel and what promises to be a very illuminating discussion on today's topic, which is toward a free and open Indo-Pacific region, strengthening the U.S., Japan, India trilateral relationship. While you were perhaps not noticing, a conceptual revolution has been taking place among policymakers, among strategic thinkers, among political economists, and others with regard to the relationship between the nations that cluster around the Indian Ocean and those that are geographically situated around the Pacific Ocean. A growing awareness that these two great bodies of water and the different nations and cultures that have grown up around them over thousands of years, in fact, today share much more in common than they have in terms of difference. And that today, to speak of the Indo-Pacific region makes sense from a political and cultural standpoint, as well as from a strategic and economic standpoint. And this awareness that this region now forms a single whole is part of the important background to the issues that we're going to be discussing and thinking about this afternoon. This idea of a Indo-Pacific region forming a whole has come about for a couple of reasons. One has been the pressure of globalization and the degree to which the economies of those two regions have now drawn increasingly closer together as economies have grown closer together around the world. The other reason is the pressure from an effort by a particular country, namely the People's Republic of China, to exert its hegemonal role in the Indo-Pacific region, a role that it has begun to enforce from the Horn of Africa across to the South China Sea. And the degree to which thinking about how the Indo-Pacific region will thrive and prosper and remain peaceful and secure in the future has a very great deal to do with the second of those pressures on the way in which we think about and we are forced to think about the Indo-Pacific region as a whole. Whatever that future may be, and wherever direction policy goes in this country as well as others, will increasingly rest, in my opinion, on the relationship between three countries, namely the United States, India, and Japan. It was in 2015, if I may take a personal note, that I published an article in Nikkei Asian Review about how the India-Japan alliance would transform the face of Asia. And in that article, I also stressed the pivotal role the United States would play in the shaping of the future of that alliance. And now I think almost 5 years later, what I've come to realize is that that alliance and that relationship between the three countries is now going to not only transform the future of Asia, but also transform the future of the world, including the Indo-Pacific region. Now, to take up these issues, to talk about what impact that growing trilateral relationship between India, United States, and Japan will look like, what the consequences are of those nations drawing together and working more cooperatively, what are the concrete roles that each can play in the shaping of that trilateral relationship? Well, that's the discussion that we're going to open up this afternoon. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you our three principal speakers on this topic, each of whom represents and can speak to the salient issues relating to the three countries in question. The first of our speakers will be Nobukatsu Kanehara, the Assistant Chief Cabinet Secretary and Deputy Director General of the National Security Secretariat of Japan. He has previously served in the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, at the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty Division, the European Affairs Bureau, and the Directorate of Policy Planning. Prior to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he also worked at the Embassy of Japan in Washington, D.C. And as I think you'll discover from his remarks in the course of our discussion, he also brings a great deal of knowledge and experience to the relationship between Japan and India as well. Our second speaker is Tom Rose, Senior Advisor and Chief Strategist for the Office of the Vice President of the United States. Prior to his service in the administration, Mr. Rose was publisher and CEO of the Jerusalem Post from 1997 to 2005. And despite being an American citizen, during the Gulf War, he volunteered for service in the Israeli Defense Forces. He's a graduate of the Columbia School of Journalism. We at Hudson Institute count him among our particular friends, and therefore we are give a particularly warm welcome to Mr. Rose as part of our discussion. Our third speaker is Vice Admiral Shekhar Sinha, former Commander-in-Chief of India's Western Naval Command. In a decorated 40-year career in the Indian Navy, Admiral Sinha held a number of appointments, including Chief of the Integrated Defense Staff and Controller of Personnel Services. He's a graduate of India's College of Naval Warfare and Naval Defense College, and since his retirement from the Indian Navy, Admiral Sinha has been active on strategic issues surrounding the Indo-Pacific. He's also a member of the Board of Trustees of the India Foundation. Now, after the statements from our three speakers, we're going to open up the discussion for questions. And then following that, we are going to bring you a special treat. And that is two of our distinguished Hudson Institute fellows, Mike Pillsbury and Patrick Cronin, are going to join us here on the podium and on the stage for a further discussion and to answer any more questions that you may have as from the audience. But without further ceremony, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce to you Nobukatsu Kanehara.
Speak here? Thank you very much for kind introduction. Did you hear me? Is the microphone okay? I'm talking about today the most important relationship of the 21st century, triangular cooperation among US, India, and Japan. In the first place, I have to say that my personal views are mixed up. I'm not totally representing my governments, but I could freely express my views rather today. The purpose of this century is to create the liberal world order, free world on a global scale. Humanity has struggled to achieve this goal for more than 200 years. Now we see finally that our efforts are coming to fruition. The liberal world order means a world where everyone's dignity is respected. Everybody is free and equal, regardless of skin color, language, culture, gender, political creed, and religion. Many great men stood up for this cause, and some fell under bullets. Lincoln, Gandhi, Reverend King, Mandela, and others are the true leaders of the whole of humanity. Let us see briefly what we have overcome in the modern era. The industrial transformation on a global scale started 200 years ago. In Great Britain, the combination of fossil energy and machines drove human civilization from 10,000 years agriculture civilization to industrialization. A handful of nations became quickly very powerful precursors and became the rulers of the globe. Great Britain, United States, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, finally Japan. They are now called the advanced industrial democracies, except Russia, where a communist state was created in 1917. The transformation of the world order triggered many difficulties, complications, and confusions as follows. The first calamity was the power struggle among the new masters of the globe. The culmination was the two world wars. The wars were not only mechanized, but total, because of the emergence of nation states. Typical examples are Napoleonic France or Meiji-era Japan. Hundreds of millions died namelessly, both military and civilians. After World War II, we have established the United Nations to stop wars, but the institution was not enough. Soon, the United Nations became dysfunctional because of the confrontation between the East and the West. It is only the emergence of the nuclear weapons that made a total war too painful. The nuclear dissuasion prevented major powers from waging wars against each other. In fact, for 70 years, the Third World War never happened. Second calamity associated with industrialization was the misery of city workers in the first phase of industrialization. This produced the moderate labor union movement in the West, but after the Russian Revolution, violence became a legitimate part of communism. Heavily ideological and oppressive rule appeared in some countries. The Cold War between the free world and the communist bloc continued for almost 50 years and ended with the collapse of the communist bloc from inside. The third calamity was the colonization of Asians and Africans and racial discrimination. 150 years ago, neither Karl Marx or Max Weber ever thought that Asia and Africa could develop. Racism was deeply rooted in such thinking in the disguise of the pseudo-science of social Darwinism. But industrialization can happen anywhere on the globe where people are educated, industrious, and trustworthy. Industrial wealth spread from Europe across the Atlantic to the New World, and now it is spreading from East Asia and Southeast Asia to West Asia. Meanwhile, the Westerners changed profoundly. I could not overemphasize the importance of civil rights movement of the United States. Reverend King abolished state-sponsored racism at the cost of his own life. In the 1960s, the United States was already the leader of the free world. When the United States left racism behind, the idea of the US Constitution became the beacon of the whole humanity. The United States became not only the leader of the West, but now also the leader of the humanity. Asians share instinctively the ideals of the US Constitution because there are many similar elements in Asian political thinking. For example, Shoin Yoshida, who was a teacher, revolutionary, and a precursor of Meiji Restoration of Japan, said, citing Mencius, a Chinese philosopher of 2,300 years ago, that Heaven has no ears and no eyes. So heaven sees and listens through people's eyes and ears. So that people's will is heaven's will. Mencius even continues that those who go against heaven's will must perish. The United States was a hope even during the European imperialist age for the Japanese. Foreign Minister Munemitsu, 19th century, at the time of Sino-Japanese War, wrote a poem entitled World History Book as a young revolutionary in jail. It says that there has never been even a single just war in world history. The world is like a jungle, but only in reading the chapter on the independence of the United States, tears well up in my eyes with joy. Many Asians and Africans achieved independence after World War II. India achieved independence without violence, and it became a leader of the global independence movement. Some nations fought wars for independence with difficulties. Central Asians attained independence as late as in 1990s. I should note that there are still some voluminous minorities in Asia and other places who deplore their subjugation. The newest political feature of Asia is a series of democratization taking place in nations of the region. In 1986, the first one, the Philippines, achieved democratization. In 1987, South Korea followed, and one by one, South Asian nations like Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Myanmar turned into democracies. Taiwan is now fully democratic. They are very proud of their own democracy. They feel ownership of their own democracy. They feel free. They feel equal with us. Unfortunately, there are flaws in young democracies, but they aspire to be recognized as equal partners of the free world, not pupils. Asia is becoming a new test field of the creation of the liberal world order. Free Asia is at stake. Europe has been radically ahead in creating a new community since the end of the World War II, but now fatigue spreads, and they are in trouble with Brexit as a prime example. On the contrary, in Asia, very bold and the first steps are being taken toward a free and open Indo-Pacific community. A new liberal Asian order is emerging based upon universal values, freedom and democracy. To sustain this trend toward the global liberal world order in Asia, cooperation among US, India, and Japan is critical. I should add Australia and Europe. Here are some reasons for it. Reason one is that we, the three nations, share universal values: human dignity, freedom, human rights, democracy, peace, and nonviolence are not just propaganda for us. We do believe in these ideals. Lincoln, Reverend King, Gandhi were all killed for the same cause. I should say that Japan took the lead in abolishing racism at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919 without success. Human community must be created by agreements and consensus. A community must be based upon rules, agreed rules, because each man, woman have the same dignity. No man can rule the others without consent. Guns and money do not give any legitimacy to the ruler. Only people's general will can give legitimacy to the ruler. Reason two is that India is the last superpower to emerge. The world history of global industrialization will come to an end with a big chapter on India. Now, India's population will soon exceed that of China, and it is a very young population. Population dynamics are pushing down Asian nations like China, but pushing up India. Soon, India will grow like Japan in the 1960s or China at the dawn of this century. To keep the strategic balance with the still growing China, the combination of US, European Union, and Japan are not heavy enough. Japan, at the time of the Pacific War, Japan was 10% of the United States in terms of industrial base. Germany, under Meiji, was 30%. Today's China is at 60% of the US GDP. China's economy is now more than twice as big as Japan, and its military expenditure is 4 times bigger than Japan's. Japan's defense budget is as big as, say, British or the French ones, and China has a 2 million strong military force. Only with India on our side can we guarantee a strategic balance on the global scale with China. Reason 3 is the freedom navigation and free trade. Trade is one of the most ancient human practices. Adam Smith gave us a theory of God's hand to it. Free trade promotes global competition and maximizes productivity and thus maximizes the welfare of the people globally. The competition in a single market shall be fair. There are winners and losers, but fair competition gives losers incentives to improve productivity and to be creative and competitive again. There is always a chance to shine again. Free trade must be protected from piracy, illegal smuggling by gangsters, and illegal closure of maritime routes by any particular nation or nations. The protection of free sea lanes is the responsibility of all the major naval nations. They should be guardians of freedom of navigation on the high seas. A good example is the multilateral anti-piracy activities in the Gulf of Aden. Japanese patrol planes are flying there even today with Americans, Europeans, Chinese. But China claims that South China Sea is their own sea. This claim is as new as this century. The South China Sea is bigger than the Mediterranean. Historically, the Mediterranean was under the control of the Romans, Arabs, French Normans, Venice Ottoman Empire, and finally the British. Nobody said that the Mediterranean is my sea or closed sea. In addition, in the high seas, there's no coastal state or non-coastal state. South China Sea was a very busy crossroad for merchants of every region for more than a millennium. The merchants were Japanese, Chinese, Malays, Indians, Persians, Arabs, and finally Europeans. It is a Times Square in the Sea of Asia. Free navigation must be upheld. The fourth and final reason is technology. Humans are entering a new era. Again, there are so many new horizons that have suddenly opened. AI, robotics, quantum technology, nanotechnology, neuron, brain-machine interface, 3D printer, regeneration, genetic science, etc. The United States, Japan, and India together with Europeans are still leading the world in science and development of new technologies. Many of the best scientists are in these countries. These new technologies are correlated. People might be surprised at some moments at the new emerging technology that could change suddenly and totally economic, social, and even military landscape of the world. And the new digital world is supported by a handful of platform giants like GAFA. The competition platforms should promote the free flow of data for the welfare of the people in the world, but we should pay attention to the risk of infringement of privacy, intellectual property, while combating cyber thefts and cyber attack. The competition of platforms is culminating into the further struggle for information hegemony or the superiority in the 21st century. Two blocks are appearing. One tries to achieve the maximum free flow of data based upon trust and rules. The other tries to maximize efficiency and convenience, allowing total surveillance by the state, leaving virtually no privacy or any freedom of speech. How our future society appears will depend upon which model prevails in the future. Here, too, is a fruitful field for cooperation among the United States, India, and Japan. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tom Rose. Let me set my timer here so Arthur Herman doesn't exert his executive authority to have me shot.
Terrible. Terrible.
I guess Pillsbury and Herman are both debating as to who gets the honor, but it's a tremendous honor for me to be here with you this afternoon when our good friend Scooter Libby phoned to invite me to participate in this prestigious event. My very first reaction was, thanks, Scooter, who canceled? And sure enough, he had several answers to that question. Would you like the list alphabetically, he asked, or it is a great pleasure, an honor to be here with old friends and new friends. President Trump assumed office, as we all know, 2 years ago last month, during a time of extraordinary threats to our nation, to our allies, and to the world. And the first thing he did, we did, our national security team did, was to compile a list of those threats and categorize them into 5 areas. And this is not in order of importance, but these were the 5 areas that we perceive to be the most urgent and greatest threats to our people, our way of life, our prosperity, our security, and our influence. And they are, again, rogue regimes developing nuclear weapons, in particular, Iran and North Korea, the rise of rival geopolitical powers, that would be Russia, Iran, and of course the People's Republic of China. The third area we found compelling and threatening is one that is much in the news today. That is porous borders and unenforced immigration laws. The fourth issue we found as, and still believe to be a fundamental threat to the American way of life, is unfair trade practices that have hurt our economy and our people. And the final one, of relevance to everyone in this room, certainly our partners in Japan, our treaty allies in Japan, our friends and partners in India, unfair burden sharing with our allies and inadequate investment in our own defense here at home. Vice President Pence and I just returned from the Munich Security Conference and Secretary Mike Pompeo's ministerial on Mideast security in Warsaw, Poland, late last week. And this was the primary topic of concern that we addressed our allies, especially in Europe, on unfair burden sharing. Taking the threats and the challenges that we see and wrapping them up into our goals, our strategies, our end game. Very simple, again, 4 areas. This is all outlined in our national security strategy, which was published and made official in December of 2017. Protecting the American people, the American homeland, our way of life. To do that by defending, of course, against weapons of mass destruction, establishing and creating an effective means of combating bio threats and pandemic disease, strengthening our border and controlling our immigration policy, pursuing threats to their ultimate source, especially when it comes to radical Islam and jihadist threats, to attack and dismantle international, transnational criminal organizations, keeping the country safe in the cyber era, and promoting American resilience. And when it comes to promoting American prosperity, the challenge and the opportunity is equally great for us at home and equally critical for our allies, especially Japan, Korea, our European allies, and our friends and strategic partners in India, and that's to rejuvenate and revitalize our domestic economy, to promote free, fair, and reciprocal economic relationships, to continue leading in research, technology, innovation, and invention. And there, the 3 of us this afternoon and you have a great deal to talk about, because our strategic challenge in the rise of rival geopolitical power in the People's Republic of China presents a challenge that the West, frankly, has never faced in its 350-year dominance of the scientific revolution and industrial and economic advance. Essential to all of this, of course, is preserving peace through strength. Much has been written and talked about how, quote-unquote, hostile or provocative our newfound approach to the People's Republic of China, thanks almost exclusively to Dr. Pillsbury, who sits in the front row. I asked at lunch whether or not China has a Pillsbury expert. We have We have many China experts in this country. We're wondering if China has a Pillsbury expert as we work with Dr. Pillsbury, learn from him, and develop a strategy to peacefully but effectively deal with the rise of a new superpower, the People's Republic of China. And the way we enhance, strengthen peace through strength is to renew and grow our competitive advantages, to renew our military capabilities, to reinvigorate our defense industrial base, which we're doing, to modernize our nuclear forces, which we're doing, to advance and prioritize our space defense capabilities, which we're doing. In fact, I leave from here and go right to a Space Force conference back at the White House, cyberspace, enhanced intelligence, and of course, diplomacy and statecraft, which a lot of our friends, I use that term loosely in the media, consistently accuse us of disparaging or diminishing. We take great exception to that. We think diplomacy and statecraft are essential, but that diplomacy has to be based on the world as it is, not as we might like to see it. The president likes to call this approach principled realism. And when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, I think our actions and those of our partners and allies speak for themselves. Vice President Pence has been to Asia 4 times in 2 years. We just recently visited Japan, Singapore, Australia, and Papua New Guinea for the APEC summit to reaffirm President Trump's commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific in which all nations are sovereign, strong, and prosperous. For 2 centuries, American security and prosperity have depended upon a free and open Indo-Pacific, access to the Indo-Pacific region for all nations, allowing for two-way investment, multilateral investment, and trade that today supports millions of American jobs. And these numbers are going to grow as our administration counteracts state-sponsored theft of intellectual property and other market distortions that fuel trade imbalances, which are no longer tolerable for us. Everyone in this room knows that the Indo-Pacific encompasses more than half the Earth's surface, more than half the world's population, and nearly 3/4 of its global trade. The economic and strategic significance of the Indo-Pacific to Americans grows by the day. America's made foreign direct investments of $1.5 trillion in the Indo-Pacific region. These, of course, are private investments, more than Chinese, Japanese, South Korean investments combined. Our America First economic agenda means America first, but never America alone. This includes deregulation, tax cuts, tax reform, and it also means an America that can attract more investment from the Indo-Pacific than ever before. Vice President Pence, on his trip, announced new initiatives that will advance fair and reciprocal trade and mobilize even greater investment. The BUILD Act, as you all know, which President Trump signed back in October, will double U.S. development finance capacity to more than $60 billion. Just a couple of months ago, the U.S. and Japan and Australia signed a trilateral memorandum of understanding on developing the finance cooperation throughout the Indo-Pacific. We've updated the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. We are in the midst of what we all hope will be very successful negotiations on a U.S.-Japan Free Trade Agreement. Through the U.S.-Japan Strategic Energy Partnership, Japan will align $10 billion in regional investment targets together with our administration, the Trump administration's Asia Edge initiative. The new U.S.-ASEAN Smart Cities Partnership is already bearing fruit, helping municipal governments advance the digital transformation of urban systems throughout the Indo-Pacific. And the U.S. SEGA program will build capacity in APEC countries to adapt high-standard comprehensive trade and investment policies. Vice President Pence deepen cooperation with allies and partners on the most urgent regional threat, and that is North Korean denuclearization, freedom of navigation in the East and South China Seas, and the continuing fight against terrorism and violent extremism. The U.S. and Japan recently announced delivery of 10 F-35As, valued at about $1.4 billion, under our foreign military sales program, with 6 more to be delivered this year. The U.S. is continuing to provide more than $500 million in security assistance to Indo-Pacific nations this year. That's more than double last year. And the U.S. is continuing to expand its maritime security cooperation in the Indian Ocean region and the Pacific Islands. Our defense partnerships and mutual programs with India also are growing and bearing fruit that we hope benefits both our nations. While in Asia this past November, Vice President Pence announced the Indo-Pacific Transparency Initiative to help countries attract more private investment, combat corruption, and secure nations' autonomy from foreign coercion. Our purpose and our goals are clear, and that is to promote sound, just, and responsive governance through efforts to counter corruption, while we seek to encourage strong civil society and honest business practices throughout the region. In conjunction with more than $400 million, the Indo-Pacific Transparency Initiative will cooperate with allies, partners, and regional institutions, including ASEAN and APEC, to advance these shared principles. Our agenda is bold. Our accomplishments, I think, speak for themselves. And our purpose is the purpose of all free peoples in the Indo-Pacific region, and that is to address the challenges and the dangers that face us in a responsible, realistic, but effective way. The best way to prevent conflict is to be prepared to confront it if necessary. We're absolutely convinced that conflict need not be the ultimate resolution of the rise of a great new power, and we're prepared to do all that we can to assure that it doesn't, and to be prepared that if, God forbid, it does, we're prepared. We think that's the best way to maintain peace, is to strive for peace through strength. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's always good to speak at the last because most of the things which I wanted to say has been said. But let us not assume that I am also saying thank you very much. Firstly, good afternoon, and my very distinguished co-panelists, discussants, and the research faculty here. It's always good to come back occasionally to Hudson. And I get to learn a lot of things. Special thanks to both Ambassador Haqqani and Director Aparna Pandey for making it possible, for the invite, and Thomson Klim for having tied all the logistics and guide me through the preliminaries of this trilateral. And I begin with the disclaimer that I don't necessarily project the government's view, Indian government's view. I have retired nearly 5 years ago. But I do share my views with those who study the geopolitics, which is evolving in the Indo-Pacific in general and Indian Ocean in particular. So focus of my talk will be more India-centric, and I expect that much of it will also emerge during the Q&A. Let me come straight to the point. India has unresolved land borders with two nuclear-armed countries who share very close relationship between themselves. Often this friendship has been described as higher than mountains and deeper than sea. This is not only a slogan, but the outcomes are gradually unfolding, and there will be much more to follow. We are pretty close to those areas, and therefore we see it happening. As far as India's strained relationship is concerned, it is worse with our western neighbor than the northern neighbor. However, the collusion of the two is a reality, and that is what India has been dealing for many, many years by now. Then what is new? Why is that we are talking about the elephant in the room, China? We are talking about dragon in the room, maybe. That is because it is China's emergence as a maritime power in the Indo-Pacific which makes matters complex for India. It has to look at China now on a much wider canvas which extends from the Himalayas to the Indian Ocean. China-Pakistan axis is not only limited to CPEC or the BRI, but also in the larger Indian Ocean sort of context. China's desire to upstage the US from economic leadership may get fulfilled. Our very distinguished speakers have said so. Slowly or maybe quickly, it will, sooner or later. But our belief in India is that China will not succeed in replacing the US from the techno-military leadership anytime soon, or maybe never. Why is there a turbulence in the Indo-Pacific then? It's because the first time since the collapse of the Cold War that the unipolarity of the US is being challenged. We have no doubts that China's ultimate aim is to replace the US from the top slot. The reason of turbulence is China's irrational assumption that time has come for it to exercise leadership and the world must choose an ally. So that is the reason for the turbulence and probably the talk that we're having here. So during one of my visits to Beijing, while a conversation with a senior functionary of the CPC, they asked me that, would you maintain neutrality in the likely scenario of face-off with the US? So obviously our closeness worries them. So that is the important point. My quick response was, what was in it for India? US has been a good friend. They are giving us state-of-the-art weapons and technology transfer will happen. Will China resolve the border issue with India? And that was the end of our conversation. We headed for a glass of wine. So there you are. This was around 2013 when I was heading the Western Naval Command. We were preparing to receive our aircraft carrier Vikramaditya from Murmansk in Russia. We had reports that the Chinese would be deploying their nuclear submarine in the Indian Ocean. I'm sure you would have seen it in the press. Basically to monitor the acoustic signatures of the aircraft carrier's propellers. In short, I can say that they didn't succeed. What happened, that is another story. We will talk about it some other time. But we realized that Indian Ocean was getting crowded, which would restrain Indian Navy's strategic maneuvering space. So far, we had mechanisms in India to handle the collusion of China and Pakistan on land borders, but a situation was developing to expand this mechanism into the Indian Ocean. Some of it has been put in place, and during Q&A, if you still remember this point, maybe I can come back to this. Having watched China's painful rise and shameless assertiveness in which it threw the International Court of Justice judgment on the Scarborough Shoals to the winds, we knew that the disputes on land border will be used by China as a handle in its emerging competition with India in the Indian Ocean. So that is a reality. We have to keep that in mind, that we have a land border on which Chinese at the moment, they are many times bigger, and we need to build our capabilities there so that we can hold them off. So we had this crisis in Doklam, if you have been following the press, and we managed to sort of, in a standoff, we managed to push them back from where they came. Our equation with US and Japan have moved many notches up, particularly after the present government of Prime Minister Modi came to power. We have been operating with the US Navy from the 90s, well before President Obama's pivot to Asia-Pacific policy was announced. Now we saw this opportunity, the present scenario, to invite Japan in the Malabar series exercises to message to China that it will not have a free ride in this conquest to dominate the Indo-Pacific. Japan and India import large quantities of oil from Gulf, and so does China. So we are all vulnerable. To secure its energy lanes of communication across the Straits of Hormuz, China has established a foothold in Gwadar port in Pakistan, which is right on the mouth of the Gulf of Oman. In future, it will have surveillance and interdiction capability against US and NATO forces operating in and out of Gulf. And I mentioned this to then 5th Fleet Commander when I was visiting him in Bahrain in 2013. 5th Fleet will certainly get bottled at this choke point, and we have a common cause there which calls for capacity building of India. Not that we are not there, we are there all the time. But of course, it will require a new sort of threat perception which needs to be handled. And capacity building, when we say we talk about both economic and military, we don't only talk about, because ultimately one needs the other. And the present government, the Prime Minister, he made a big slogan, SAGAR, S-A-G-A-R, security and growth for all in the region. So he's realized that there is a security and growth are linked. Unless you have one, you cannot drive the other one on both ways. So I think that is what the understanding of the government is, and most of the policies of Act East, Sagar and Sagar Mala, those are primarily meant for these. While Japan is deeply engaged in infrastructure development for better connectivity and growth of trade, on one hand, US has been very active on the security-related capacity building, but this needs to be hastened because we have a very small window of few years after which the Chinese would probably emerge with a bigger force in the Indian Ocean. There are some sectors which I think that there is a future cooperation. Some of it, the Deputy Cabinet Secretary, he mentioned about this. Sectors like cyber, artificial intelligence, space, higher technical education, quantum science, agriculture, water conservation, green energy, pollution control research, manufacturing processes, because India missed the bus of the Industrial Revolution, and therefore the processes have to be built up. So that is what is required. Our production capacity exists, but the quantums what we produce is not adequate to meet the today's requirement, and that needs to be built up. These are the areas which both US and Japan can progress fairly rapidly. Both military and non-military cooperation is required. The momentum of bilateral relationship with US and Japan intensified after President Trump moved into White House, and Prime Minister Abe won another term, making him the PM who would probably be serving as the longest serving PM in the history of Japan. Signing of Limoa and Comcasa, some of you may be aware, with the US was clearly a reflection of its desire to see India playing a larger role in resisting the rise of China. With Japan, the cooperation is more towards connectivity and economic related projects, and also offers more transparent financial system in the IOR, which is there for other ASEAN countries and Southeast Asian countries to follow, and don't fall into the debt trap of the Chinese like some of the countries have. So driven by these realities, the US has placed India on the exempt list of CAATSA and secondary sanctions for helping India build its own capacities. And this needs to be continued. Any obstruction of any kind may be very counterproductive and slow down what we want to achieve. There are reports that India will be removed from the Generalized System of Preferences, GSP list, which could impact, by additional tariff on nearly $5.6 billion export which India does to the US. For the US, it is important to develop much closer ties with China's neighbors, in East and Southeast Asia and Indian Ocean. That's very important. Only then you can actually counter him. Otherwise, it will be much tougher, and the forces required, the US Navy forces required in the area will be much larger, which is a bit, long call. Talking of Indo-Pacific security architecture, the vastness of these oceans call for regional architecture approach within a larger Indo-Pacific architecture. This is our belief that it's too big an area for just one or two countries to take care of. So this is what, there are three different regions. One is clearly Pacific, East Asia and the parts of Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And each of these could be coordinated by the regional paths, that is Australia in the closer Pacific, Japan in the East Sea and South China Sea. This is very important, mainly because if we don't make this peacetime multilateral organizations, then China is already thinking of creating its own based on the participants or signatories of the Code of Conduct agreement. And that could be very dangerous because they're very small nations. They will say yes to anything that China says, and it will only encourage China to take more illegal actions which are not permitted by the UNCLOS, or as we understand, as far as free and open sort of passage for navigation for our ships. And Japan could invite, I don't know how many will say yes, but I think most of them should. Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and South Korea. These navies can work together to follow a single SOP and also help them in develop their capabilities to handle non-traditional threats. Under that heading, a lot can be done. And with some countries, we are doing that. So that it can, handle HADR type mission as well. You can go up to the LPD type of ships as well for these countries. And Japanese have this all capability of manufacturing. Non-traditional threats when I talk about talks about piracy, theft, human and drug trafficking, illegal mining, sharing of void shipping data, maritime intelligence sharing. So these are some areas where it can be done very easily, doesn't call for any classified information exchange, except for the militaries when it comes to maritime intelligence. That is important. Otherwise, that's one advantage which maritime cooperation has. Something which is happening in South China Sea won't happen all of a sudden. It will start from somewhere. It will take some time for it to move, and that time frame can be utilized to move your forces accordingly to restrict or resist. Why I'm saying, because China has been mulling over the joint exercises of Southeast Asian countries under the pretext of the Code of Conduct monitoring in the South China Sea. And possibility is that China might call it a maritime security force and use it to its own strategic advantage. I would mention here that in the system of governance on China, there is no room to accommodate any counter argument like we have in the democracies. Well, you can differ with the Prime Minister, you can differ with the President, and you can say so. It's not illegal. But you can't do that in China. Some of you who are more familiar, maybe Mr. Pillsbury will have more to say when he comes and gives his final expert comment. India should invite all the Bay of Bengal countries and Maldives, Seychelles and Mauritius to witness the trilateral exercises like Malabar that we do, or the bilateral exercises we have with Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Singapore and Indonesia. If you get the participants from these countries, the confidence will build up. Right now, there is not enough confidence of these small groupings with with a democratic country heading it. And everybody is sort of worried about what will China think, what will China do. China says a lot of things, but he can't do it. Let me tell you that even in Indian Ocean, we are quite confident that China is still a long way off from challenging the assets that the Indian Navy has on date. And the way our forces have now been sort of readjusted, it's not easy for China to. They're far off from their land. They're far off. They're not a sort of seafaring country historically. And we know this, and so does China. And that is why he keeps talking about cooperation with India. That is because he knows if he doesn't do it, it's a little grief. So they will come back. So we have to build a confidence building sort of mechanism within our own regions so that you invite them for every exercise and let them realize that this is for the good of the whole region, and therefore encourage them to come and join this. Similarly, Australian Navy could play an important role in building its capacity and providing training to these nations. But I must add that Australia has to build its own naval capability, which is grossly inadequate to handle this task that we are talking about. I make this statement with great conviction. I know that there are a lot of people are smiling their mind. throw some question, but I have the details and I can tell you that, it is not enough. They have had their own problems of acquisition. As you know, democracies are not very quick to take decisions, and particularly the democracy that we live in. But once it rises, oh boy, it rises very rapidly. So that is what it is. So in all these regional architectures, US would have to remain as a common factor. If US does not back any of this physically with the forces deployed, but not in such a great extent, but a small extent. So what I'll do is that I would like to stop here and maybe take on whatever you have in the question answer. Thank you.
I want to thank all three speakers. I'm Louis Libby, Senior Vice President here at the Hudson Institute. In the spirit of my colleagues' comments, I should say that no government claims my views. I feel free to denounce my views at any point necessary. It's a great privilege for us at Hudson to have here three speakers such as these. For those of you who are interested in these topics, I cannot recommend highly enough Secretary General Kanehara's speech in 2017 at Columbia University and his speech in 2018 at West Point. They're terrific compliments to this one. And Tom Rose, I've had the pleasure to be with him at the Mount Fuji Dialogue. I recommend his comments from the October 2018 speech. And Admiral Sinha has been part of Hudson Trilateral discussions several times, and terrific materials. Before we begin with questions, we have a rare opportunity to have a couple other Hudson scholars come up and talk about this. Patrick Cronin has just come back from Southeast Asia and has some particular views. Patrick heads a practice here that looks at the East Asian region.
Thank you very much, and what an honor to be with such a distinguished panel. Just to make a few brief comments. Southeast Asia is at the heart of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And if it's going to remain free and open out in these future decades, it's going to be these three countries that are going to have to be at the center of protecting that. Just to remind a wide audience of the size of Southeast Asia, 660 million people as of this month in the 10 Southeast Asian countries that comprise ASEAN, vibrant young populations in most of these countries. So we're talking about shaping the future of middle-class growth, India, Southeast Asia. This is where major middle-income growth is going to come from in the world in the coming decades. Looking at 2030, for instance, just over a decade from now, if you remove the Communist Party-led China, the next four biggest economies by purchasing power parity will be the United States, India, Japan, and Indonesia. Vibrant democratic community that will be important. What I want to say about this is that China is rewriting the rules right now very swiftly. So if these democracies and these countries don't help lead an alternative movement to write and adapt the rules of the world order, China will do it for us. And they're doing it largely through, as the Admiral mentioned, the Code of Conduct. China had been asleep on a Code of Conduct, dragging their feet, not interested at all in actually negotiating, moving from a Declaration of Conduct some 17 years ago toward a code. Now they're in a hurry to force a bad deal on Southeast Asian nations. They're hoping to essentially co-opt elites in Manila and in Thailand. Thailand's in the chair of ASEAN this year. And to therefore isolate Vietnam, the one country that's really willing to stand up right now to China's hegemony. They want to rewrite the rules in two ways, and we've already seen this in their draft Code of Conduct. They want to stop American, in particular, American military movement, lawful under international law. We've just conducted our 15th freedom of navigation operation in the last decade or so in the South China Sea. And China is getting more aggressive and more assertive and wants to isolate that, because if they can stop American military movement through international waters and sailing and flying through the air over these international waters, then there's nothing Southeast Asian countries can do. They can't stand up to China. China will then be in a position to stop the navigation that they claim they've never stopped. It's true, they haven't stopped it. They're waiting for, they're into a position of strength. They also want to exploit development. So if you think about the cabbage strategy that China employs, they use maritime militia, essentially a third naval arm, Coast Guard ships, and then their PLA Navy rests back. They did this in Scarborough Shoal in 2012. They did it off the coast of Vietnam in 2014 with a deep sea oil rig, which was triggered by the fact that India and Vietnam wanted to do joint oil exploration. China didn't want that to happen. They wanted to rewrite the rules so that China's rules dominated, not international rules. And they employed a cabbage strategy there. And so these are the way that China wants to rewrite these rules. I saw this in Manila and Jakarta just this past 2 weeks. And it's clear that India, Japan, the United States can do much more together here to stand up toward a common approach toward international law that doesn't allow China to create an exclusive regional sphere of influence with exclusive rules. We don't agree on these rules entirely, so that's why we have to come together and try to fashion a tighter alignment on what to do. We also need to obviously build up maritime domain awareness. So if you think about Sabang and Andaman Sea, this is the westernmost portion of Indonesia. It's right near Andaman and Nicobar Islands, where Japan is helping to invest in both cases. This is where these three countries can come together, and on that western side of the Strait of Malacca, the throat that combines and joins the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, this is where we should be doing more and stepping up that maritime domain awareness. And then over the long term, we can do much more in terms of anti-submarine warfare. Last point here is that it's a scary thought to think what the Chinese are doing completely out of sight in the South China Sea. I believe that the surveillance state that China has created and is using in Western China, in Xinjiang, for instance, they're trying to build under the South China Sea so that they can eventually, through quantum computing, through robotic submarines, they've talked about building a fleet of 20 robotic submarines. This was the Chinese Academy of Science announced last year. They're going to use floating nuclear power plants. This is in the South China Sea, so that they can track every segment of the seafloor. They can exploit the minerals, but they can also achieve dominance under the sea. Very big challenges, and it's only these three countries that can help lead and help support Southeast Asia so that they can continue to be free and open for decades to come. Thank you very much.
Now a few comments from Michael Pillsbury, who's the head of our Chinese strategy program, if I recall.
There's no way to the platform. Thank you, Scooter. I think I just want to make 2 points, and I get like 3 minutes, so it's 1.5 minutes per point.
Take 4.
Okay. The first point is it's very important and exciting, actually, to read the writings of President Donald Trump about China. He first has a long section in a book that was published in the year 2000 called The America We Deserve. He has several pages where he describes his admiration for Chinese negotiating tactics and that China will be the greatest challenge the United States faces in the future. That's 19 years ago. He also wrote about China later on in another book, which he described them as the world's best negotiators, and that the only way really to win against China, which he didn't think was very likely, would be for a negotiator to employ what he called unpredictability, or to be unpredictable. Since he assumed office, he has repeated many of his campaign comments about the challenge of China. But you'll notice in these writings I mentioned, and in the campaign comments, and in the more than 50 times, Nobu, I think one person counted it was 56 times, President Trump mentioned free and open Indo-Pacific in speeches. But you notice in all of this discussion, President Trump never demonizes China. He never calls them the enemy. He never even uses the word adversary. He likes the word competition. But the stress also is in his writings and in his comments on cooperation with China, including the White House several times has mentioned different figures, Tom. I'm sure Tom knows the number better than I do because I don't actually know the number. But it's roughly 30 phone calls between President Trump and President Xi, some of which the White House spokesmen have announced are as long as an hour long. Now, that's not two enemies talking to each other. Then we have these warm meetings, face to face. And the notion now that the final resolution of the trade disputes will probably come in a face-to-face conversation of some kind. So point number one I'm underlining, Scooter, is the potential for cooperation with China remains. Our largest embassy in the world by staff probably is in Beijing. Every U.S. government agency has a mission that was first created by Jimmy Carter and continues to help China, help its counterparts in China. My own book on China, The 100-Year Marathon, was the subject of a ceremony in Beijing. Some Chinese generals gave me copies. They told me a beautiful Chinese woman with a PhD from the Academy of Military Science and a colonel in the People's Liberation Army had translated the book. So I went through to check her translation. Perfect. Nothing removed. The only thing I noticed was on the cover, it said secret. So I said, wait a minute, if even one Chinese out of 3 buys it for $1 per book, I'll be much more wealthy than I am now. And they said, I'm very sorry, Dr. Pillsbury, but your book must be secret. Only party members and military officers can buy this book, and there will be no royalties for you. I said, why? This is terrible. Why? They said, chapter 3. So I had to run back and look up chapter 3. It's all about secret U.S.-China cooperation. 12 examples, not shared at the time with the Japanese or British or Indians or anyone else. So extending point number one, there's a foundation for what some people around the world are afraid of, a kind of G2 between the two great economies and powers of the world, the US and China. If the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy were a containment strategy, if it was a new Cold War, it would need machinery, it would need a bureaucracy, it would need a secretariat, it would need conferences, it would need agreements people can sign. You see any of that happening? No. No. You see voluntary White House-led meetings where people discuss common values. You see the initiatives that Tom mentioned, one of them. There's several others. Some of them come out of the Senate. But there's no bureaucracy or structure, and only one U.S. government employee, as far as I know, Tom, has a name card that has Indo-Pacific strategy on the name card. He's a brand new appointee to the NSC staff, and no one knows his name. So is this a great Cold War? Is this a great war containment plan, to stop China in its tracks? Absolutely not. But what the Chinese tell me, it could move in that direction. It could move in that direction. So that's the second point. What I would like to make, what are the areas of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific strategic approach that are yet to be tried? And one is obviously military balance of power. Could we agree on the main scenarios for conflict? Everybody knows Taiwan is the #1 scenario in American writings. What would India and Japan do in the case of a Chinese use of force against Taiwan? Have there been exercises around Taiwan by the Indian Navy and the Japanese Navy? Have there been planning conferences? Is there any preparation for this scenario? Is there a list of other scenarios? Let's say the top 5 or the top 10. The funny thing about the Chinese and their hawks and doves, my whole book is really about hawks and doves in China and how they debate each other. Some of the Chinese hawks believe this is coming and that China has to react. They're particularly sensitive to every arms sale we make to India. Every time we sell a new program to India, there's evidence the Chinese see that as the beginnings of a military alliance. I happen to believe that's not the case. But paranoid hawks in China can also be stimulated to react against the Indo-Pacific strategy. If we, in fact, do nothing more than what's already been done, and the Chinese hawks perceive it as a reason to strengthen their armed forces and gird themselves against the new Cold War, that, it seems to me, would be a nightmare. It would not be the intention of the authors of the Indo-Pacific strategy to use hollow, almost meaningless in the strategic sense, measures and rhetoric to provoke a China into much stronger, more assertive reactions than we ever expected. So that's the second point. Be careful what you wish for. So my own view is that the president balances these ideas. He's smarter than me, certainly, and he sees the choices that lie ahead for China. But don't forget that point in the second book I mentioned. Unpredictability is the best way to out-negotiate the Chinese. So how do you be unpredictable? Well, certainly vagueness and ambiguity would be in there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. There will be a collection plate in the back of the room for your missing royalties if anyone wants to contribute to Dr. Pillsbury's welfare. There have been a number of comments about the importance of the Southeast Asian nations and our guiding efforts for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Any of the panel care to comment on how this trilateral cooperation might be perceived, how it might advance the interests of, how it might help with Southeast Asia?
I think it's the purpose of this trilateral is more visible during the Malabar exercises than on any other cooperative mechanism that exists as of now. And one of the reasons why I mentioned that we should get the countries in the South China Sea littorals and the Indian Ocean littorals to come in, come on board these ships and submarines and actually see the exercises that is being done amongst these three navies. And that gives a great amount of confidence. We have tried that in a smaller exercise with these countries. One live example is Bangladesh, which was always suspicious of the sort of build-up of the Indian Armed Forces capability. Rightly so. We are probably the only big neighbor next to him. And so are we to other 6-7 countries. And my own take is that till few years back, we didn't have good equation with any of those 7 countries. But there has been some change because of little aggressive foreign policy for the neighborhood. So I think that this is one way to generate confidence. The second one, which again one has been pushing these 2-3 navies whenever we meet very informally, to say that you increase the duration of this Malabar exercise when you do it in the South China Sea. When they have operated from the ports in Japan and maybe some ports which are held by, or the Americans have a full right. We are soon going to have a very logistics exchange sort of agreement with Japan now. That is work in progress. Last time it has been discussed. And my own take when I speak to some naval headquarters, the chief and vice chief, they said, so now it is just a question of political nod as far as the worksheet is concerned is already. So we'll have a Lemoa and Comcasa type of agreement with them. So I think these things, if you expand the duration of these exercises in those areas, then your presence for longer duration itself will act as a deterrent. Because I always feel that, the Navy exercises and all, Navy exercises do not really mean that there's going to be war. But people are going to perceive that, okay, they can prevent a war. So really it is for prevention of war that you must be capable, and not only capable, you should have the will to exercise that. Occasionally you have to demonstrate this. Like China does to the smaller countries, certainly. And if you demonstrate that, look, if you, like somebody was mentioning that, go through the areas where they say that it is, you have to take China's permission, just go and do some exercises, let's see what it does.
you can actually drain him out. You can absolutely run him down. And you can do an exercise. That exercise was very so good observation. And I'm sure that something will happen sooner or later. But these are 2-3 points that I would like to say. This is one area where the Trilateral has to do more.
There has been an extraordinary level of cooperation between Prime Minister Abe and President Trump. I think it was his very first phone call after the election and his first meetings after taking office. This has been, I think, a big factor in moving forward in this area of international cooperation, which is Prime Minister Abe has also been very active in India, I know, and as has President Trump. In the midst of this, we have the new Japanese defense guidelines, which came out in December, which seem to, at least my untrained eye, to have some great discrepancies, some advances from past guidelines. And I wonder if, Kanehara-san, if you could say a few words about that.
New defense guideline was made this is the fifth one since 1970s, I think. But this is the first one that was truly made under the political guidance, because this is the first one made under the NSC. The first one, 5 years ago, the Prime Minister made the previous one, but that was not with NSC. This is the first one that was done under the NSC. So we got the periodical review by the ministerial level, and we got the instructions on how to form our self-defense force to face the challenges in the region and global. That's the reason why this new one is very substantive and the vector is very clear. Sorry. Can I go back to your first question? Sorry.
Please.
The South China Sea and ASEAN nations, the ASEAN nations are good friends of ours, but there's no NATO there. It's not organized in the military way. The principle is, they say, mutual trust and mutual respect. That is not very different from the ideals of Indo-Pacific region, free Asia, and the democratic Asia. But they do not, by the history of creation of ASEAN nations, ASEAN itself, their instinct is no entanglement in big one's fight. They saw Vietnam War, they saw Cambodia, that's the instinct, that's the reason why they're united. But they do not want to be dominated by a particular nation. At the same time, they want to be sort of a multilateral organization. That's what we respect. And that this is what we are now trying to expand into the whole Indo-Pacific region. ASEAN nations' experience is particular. We have to appreciate that. Singapore, Indonesia, they talk to each other on the same thing. No big ones bullying small ones. This is not ASEAN diplomacy. You have to drink, play golf, and do karaoke sometimes, but it is necessary. And we cannot underestimate the efforts of several decades to create this. And this is where we are. We have to support them. And in doing that, I think that they are with us. But they are smaller, the half size in population, in terms of population of China, 600 millions. Young population coming up. Like Pat says, the middle class is coming up. Democracy is taking roots. But they cannot face big ones only by themselves. Only when we say the principles, we're with them, they speak up with us. When we are silent, they are silent. So this is where Japan, India, and the United States have responsibilities to speak up. When we speak up, they speak up in one voice. Thank you.
Please.
With your permission, Chair, thank you. Just one point I wanted to make here that we have had the Minister for Maritime Affairs of Indonesia visiting Delhi. And during an open forum talk, he mentioned, as you know, that the India and Indonesia have signed an agreement by which the port of Sabang, the hinterland is being developed by the Japanese company there, and the port is being leased out to India for 30 years for operations. So what somebody mentioned about surveillance. Hopefully, we should see the joint development projects in that area. So I'm totally with you. When will it happen? I don't know, but I think some preliminary talk has already happened. Possibly maybe a month or two back. Let's see when it happens. So what is happening is that there he openly made a statement, in a forum, even larger forum, public forum, that Indonesia would like to see. Somebody asked him, why are you signing this agreement with Indians? He said, we would like to see a balanced power equation, vis-a-vis China. And that is why we think that India must start operating from this part. So somebody said that you already have Andaman Nicobar Island, those ports are not very far. He said, yeah, they're not very far, but operation of these will make sure that the ships have a larger staying power at sea, if you like. So they do have, occasionally they do speak up, but possibly when they go home, they don't speak about it, like you're mentioning, mainly because of their, apprehension about what will China do. And these apprehensions can only be removed by building the confidence, as Dr. mentioning. Get them on the exercise, let them watch it, and feel for themselves. They will find some diplomatic name to that forum, and they will do exactly the same thing what they want to do. But maybe it will be known by some more acceptable terms within the inverted commas.
Arthur may have a comment in a second, but first let me just pose one question, if I could, to Special Advisor Rose. 4 months back, Vice President Pence gave a major address here. It's been referred to about the U.S. relationship with China and China's activities. Since then, you have been over much of the world. You've been at the Munich conference, at the Polish conference, down in Singapore, Australia, Japan. And I'm curious about a few questions. One is, how were you received in those capitals? How was that speech received? And secondly, you've been in Washington. How was your speech received in Washington?
That's an excellent question. Is my thing on here? I don't know if it's on. We like to say that there's a kind of counter barometer to how speeches are received when the Vice President spoke very emphatically about burden sharing at the Munich Security Conference with some of our European allies. The reception was rather chilly, so we were fortified in our conviction we said something right, because we seemed to offend all the right people. In Asia, it's very different. I think you'll all see that and understand that. Very, very different. A much more, and I'm generalizing here, obviously, a much more realistic sense of geopolitics and the challenges that our partners in the Indo-Pacific face, as opposed to what some of our partners in Europe face or think they face. And I think it's dramatic, and as Michael was indicating earlier, his admonition, I think, was very well advised, and that is, be careful what you wish for. We are navigating on a razor blade here with no net below us in terms of how we deal with the inexorable rise of an extraordinary power that, in Henry Kissinger's term, famous phrase, the Chinese are quite happy being Chinese, thank you. They're not looking for an honorary membership in the West. And I think he was it was very relevant and timely for him to remind us, myself, the president is never disparaging of China, never disparages their leadership or their people or their accomplishments. It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary rise. Some could argue that a communist China has adopted free market capitalism far more successfully than have we, just by virtue of their growth, and that the line we tread is very very precarious. We don't want to prevent we couldn't prevent China's rise if we wanted to prevent China's rise. But the assumptions that we made, Michael points out in his book, he's one of them, he's also guilty, just like the rest of us, that we thought that growth and prosperity would midwife political reform, an opening up of society, a reintegration with the West culturally. Not only did none of that happen, the opposite happened. So we now have to recalibrate, I've used that word I think 3 times in this answer, recalibrate our relationship with China. Their senior trade delegation's here as I speak, right across the street, trying to reach our March 1 deadline. So it's extremely delicate, extremely complicated, and absolutely essential to the peace and security of all of us that we get it right. That didn't begin to answer your question, did it? Well, I'm not doing it again, so.
Close enough for government work.
The reaction to the Vice President's speech was positive. That was your answer, I think.
It was very positive. The venue is what really was, the venue is what made it so extraordinary.
Quick comment and before we open up to general questions, and that is my colleague Pat Cronin mentioned one of the most important aspects of security for the Indo-Pacific region is maritime awareness. And one of the technologies which could be hugely important for that is autonomous systems. And the role of autonomous systems in providing maritime awareness, not just in strategic or military terms, but also simply in terms of general safety, and considering the huge distances, the geographic makeup of the Indo-Pacific region, having that kind of awareness from the sky as opposed to simply from sea level is going to be hugely important in that development. And yet, a large American policy makes it very difficult for even close allies like Japan and good friends like India to acquire the kinds of large autonomous systems that would make that close that maritime awareness gap. And the gentleman on either side of you can talk about the difficulties and the hoops that both India and Japan had to go through in order to acquire autonomous systems for those kinds of purposes. And what I'm hoping is that part of strengthening the trilateral relationship among the 3 countries will be finding ways to change that U.S. policy so that large autonomous systems that are U.S. made become more available to allies, not just in the Indo-Pacific region, but also in the Middle East and also in Eastern Europe as well.
It's open to questions from the floor. Just 2 requests. First, state your name and if you have an institutional affiliation. And second, please be brief and make it a question. Sapporo.
Thank you very much for giving a chance to ask a question. My name is Satoru Nagao. I am also belong to the Hudson Institute. My question is, Admiral Sinha, the speed of India's military modernization is not fast enough. So what is the problem? How to improve? And is there something US and Japan can do? Thank you.
Please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nagao. I knew that your question will be at me because you have done that in every forum. But they're very relevant. Yes, we are going through a difficult time because the political intention is to make as many weapon systems in India as possible, and in that our cooperation with US needs to be hastened because it's not happened sufficiently. But having said that, like a good military officer, I will say that we fight with what we have. So on that account, I think that as far as the maritime assets are concerned, because we make most of our ships ourselves, the main hurdle is in the aerospace industry part. We don't have very much indigenous capability. And I'm hoping to see that we have a follow-up fighter aircraft requirement going, 111 odd aircraft. And we are hoping that some US company can have a tie-up with the Indian private sector and move in. In the rest of it, most of the weapon systems are now being made, and particularly the electronics within the Indian sort of radars, some of the weapons. But we have some distance to go. Though there are SOP in place, as I said, to monitor. And as far as MDA is concerned, which you made a very valid point, we do have a fusion center which was inaugurated about 3 or 4 weeks back by the defense minister. We have taken on about 28 countries. And Japan is the latest entrant into that. I think it should have been done. The talks were going on. So particularly for what is called the gray shipping data, people know merchant ships, and you talked about safety. So that's the relevance. If it is not a gray ship and data is not there, but you still see somebody there, we know that is not a merchant ship, then who it is. So that is one. The second thing is that you get to know the movements well in advance. Somebody who's headed for a Japanese port or outside Japan, but he's transiting through the Straits of Malacca or somewhere else, he gets to know. And it is not only airborne sort of input. It is now from satellites, Indian satellites, the aircraft, maritime patrol aircraft, other aircraft who are on these missions, surface ships, and our merchant ships with the Indian flag, as also the local assets. So we have asked Indonesia to join. Indonesia that agreement has taken place. In some places there are some discussions going on. Because what they have, the technical hitch is that unlike the US, where you have a different pages for different type of traffic, where only the merchant shipping data can hooked onto the system into the nearest satellite, where other countries have just one system, where all classified and unclassified, entire the data can be given, and that is where the difficulty is how to separate it out. And I think we talked about the technology to be given for this autonomous systems. So that is where actually the requirement is. Autonomous systems have to be developed. Otherwise, these countries will find it very difficult. We have on 2 different pages, no doubt about it. But the data handling capacity, the bandwidth is not so much that it can take on 30, 40, 50 countries like the US has. So we have some difficulty there.
Question in the back. Yes, sir.
Stanley Kober, formerly Hudson, years ago. Last week, there were terrorist bombings in Iran and India. On her way to Munich, the Indian foreign minister stopped in Iran to have conversations with the deputy Iranian foreign minister. Suggests collaboration. I'm wondering how far that collaboration could go. I'm already seeing an article in the Indian press. Instead of running to US, India must forge coalition with Afghanistan and Iran. India and Iran. If there is that sort of a coalition, possibly with combined military action, how would that affect our objective of forging an alliance of India, Japan, and the United States?
I think as I said, the worksheet for this agreement, which is just about a week and a half old, that is being worked out, and they will see up to what extent. I think that mainly to begin with, it could be possibly sharing of intelligence of the terrorist movements. At the back of it, the inputs from the US is important, but now we have to work through the US bureaucracy as to how much of data they would like to share in Iran-India sort of collaboration. But there is one area of hurdle, as you know, that countries, we are on the exempt list of 8 countries who do oil trade with Iran. There we have been permitted along with China, Japan, South Korea, and some more countries. So this is one difficult area. Our suggestion, at least till very recently, to the US administration has been that at least you please recalibrate your Iran and the Middle East policy, have a revisit and see what is realistic. And I'm glad, you mentioned, I think that people on ground, they're more realist than the high-sounding philosophical. You mentioned that? Somebody you mentioned, I think. High-sounding philosophical approach to that area. Because if Iran is part of the problem, then he better be part of the solution. If you leave him alone, it will be a little bit difficult. It may be a longer road. And we also see there is a future. When the Chabahar port becomes fully operational, direct or indirect way to use that for the logistic support of the US troops in the northern areas of Afghanistan. Whatever number of troops are left and leave Pakistan altogether, who are extracting their pound of flesh from the Americans. And there's no problem in Iran. If you go and ask, I go to Tehran and Bandar Abbas, I go quite often. We have very old civilizational sort of linkages because there's one community, Parsis, who have emerged from Persia, which is Iran. There are more Parsis in India than there are in Iran. So, in fact, long back before or even in the beginning of the Mughal Empire, Persian was the official language of India. So, we still have manuscripts in Persian written, preserved in big libraries, and it draws fair amount of visitors from Iran. So we do have, it doesn't mean that we agree to everything that Iran does. We did say that, proliferation of nuclear weapon making, etc., other than your peaceful energy source, etc., is not correct. There's a statement has been made. So we don't support every time that Iran does anything. But I think for the US to recalibrate its strategy in that area is a reality. It must be done. Because if that doesn't happen, then as you mentioned, that it might just impact the collaboration of these 3 countries. Impact means what? It will slow down the whole process of its progress. It cannot stop. But the wholehearted effort may not be there because it will slow down the things that we are doing. So I think it should happen because I see that at least in last 2-3 years, no matter how much President Trump tweets on Iran or talks about Iran, number one enemy, but he is possibly, he understands, and therefore if the India or the allies or the European Union, he has put them on the list of exempted countries, even those who do trade with Iran. So I think this is a realistic approach, and that is one of my apprehensions that with now Secretary Jim Mattis having gone, I hope there is somebody in the administration who will have a very realistic input when you formulate a bigger picture.
The lady in the back.
Thank you. My name is Jeannie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. My question is to Mr. Tom Rose as the Chief Strategist of the VP Office, and also to all the panelists. Would you discuss the role of Vietnam in the Indo-Pacific Ocean, especially in the South China Sea with the COC, the Code of Conduct that China is about to push through, and how would that impact our future trade lanes, the freedom of navigation? I also would like to ask Mr. Tom Rose about would the U.S. and all of our allies be able to both work on the Indo-Pacific as well as handle the Middle East situation, like the question just raised?
I'm sorry, deal with the Indo-Pacific
and we work and chew gum at the same time, take care of both the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East.
Well, thank you very much. I have trouble walking and chewing gum at the same time, but most of the folks in our administration can handle that. Vietnam, and we'll see, In the next 4 to 6 weeks, Vietnam prominently featured as the host for the next U.S. DPRK summit. Our relationship with Vietnam grows in importance daily. We have history with Vietnam. We were engaged in a small little conflict there for the better part of 40 years during your horrific civil war. We would have obviously been very well advised to learn a little Vietnamese history before we committed the full force of our power and prestige to battle what was largely a civil war. Vietnam, the Vietnamese people have spent, 1,000 years fighting the Chinese, protecting the integrity and sovereignty of Vietnam. Vietnam is, as we know, geographically cradled right under the giant behemoth of China. And there's a natural geopolitical rivalry between the two. And we would have been well advised to factor that in before the commitment that we made in your country turned out as terribly as it did. But thanks in large measure to the remarkable, I don't want to say forgiveness, but the absolutely extraordinary ability of the Vietnamese people to move beyond that horrible time, to embrace us, to challenge us. I mean, there's a true bond of friendship and camaraderie, I think, between the U.S. and Vietnam today, not to mention our extremely close ties with the people of Vietnam. More than 1.5 million former residents and citizens of the Republic of Vietnam and their descendants live in the United States today, full American citizens, have contributed mightily far, far beyond their numbers to the security of our country, to its prosperity, innovation, creativity. Vietnam's loss was our gain in that sense. I'm very bullish. I know Arthur Herman and Dr. Pillsbury and Pat and Scooter and everybody here have big investments in the U.S.-Vietnam relationship. And as Vietnam advances and modernizes and perhaps opens up politically, democratizes, that relationship will become even closer. But I think we'll see that. And it was no accident that Da Nang is the host of the DPRK U.S. Summit. That was, well, I don't want to say too much, but we were very fixated on making sure that Vietnam could play a role and could help us in this. The code of conduct, I'll let Scooter answer that. No, obviously, again, it's a difficult issue for us because these are sovereign matters between independent states in the Indo-Pacific and the People's Republic of China. And who's to sign off on this code of conduct, what its terms will be, how it will impact us. I mean, we're certainly making our voices heard internally as to what we think a fair, internationally legitimate code of conduct would be. But if we see countries being picked off one after another that sign up, if it's not through BRI or other initiatives that come with a new Chinese regional code of conduct attached, it is difficult to keep a united front.
By international law, China has no sovereignty in the South China Sea.
Correct.
Absolutely. Let's get one more question. We may be running out of time here. Sir.
So I represent the Pacific Tech Bridge. Good friend of Dr. Lynn Wells, who knows Mike Pillsbury and all these. And I was always working on drones and cyber since 2004, actually helped the Navy improve their maritime domain awareness. And I think the philosophy that started in 1999 allowed China to be very aggressive in the cyber realm, 240,000 hackers, very aggressive in weaponizing drones. And the core tenet of resiliency is combining national security, economic security, and trade security. So my question is, do you think it's possible, given the Chinese patterns over the last 17 years related to the internet, drones, do you think it's possible to change that behavior and respect privacy and sovereignty? Because if they don't do that, then obviously we're going to have to step in a bigger way, and we're going to have to allow exports of things, which I think we should today. Because, again, at the end of the day, I don't think we should be afraid of missiles. It's the fact that you can take a lot out with a little drone or a little cyber attack to totally disrupt economic and trade and national security. So my question to your group is, what can this relationship do to advance a cooperative agreement with China that we all respect each other? Because I don't think China has shown they do to date, but I'm not saying that we couldn't move forward in that direction, but I just don't trust they will.
Why don't we take this question as an opportunity for each of you to address the question, but also say any final comments you might like to make, because we're running out of time. Kanehara-san?
Thank you very much for your question, sir. The new sort of military technology is opening up a new horizon, and nobody can stop it. Nobody can stop it. Space, cyber, and under the sea it was exploited, but it's going in there simply because we can do it. And they have no reason to stop it. And in particular, when we share the perspective vector in the future human community, then we have to sustain the same system. I have still hope for that. But as far as they are living in a different perspective, power struggle, 19th century type, who is the hegemon, who is the leader of the world, number one is who, then there's no reason to stop it. We have to talk about rules, cyber. This is very new technology. Japan was protected by sea for 2,000 years. Only Mongols came to our shore. We just kicked them off. But we are free and peaceful for 2,000 years because of the sea. Cyber, there's no sea. Open the door, enemies here. This is cyber. This is very new. And this is very cheap. And very poor nation can train 200, 500 hackers to break the firewalls of enemies, say, defensive ministry. And I think there's no stopping this. Unless we agree to some cooperation, but even though this will develop into a new world. The discussion today in the United Nations is whether this is new cyberspace is outlaw, Wild West, or civilized East. Now we are proposing that there must be some rules here. Free flow of data must be protected, must be respected, but privacy, intellectual property, these things must be protected and must be respected. That's our position. Some nations say, no, 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 this is Wild West. We are outlaw. You can go in anywhere, you can take anywhere, you can put something there anywhere. This is outlaw space, and we say this is not right way to go. But the rule is not yet done. We have to work upon it, but in the meantime, we have to be prepared for a new phase of this technology.
I think that what we've seen this afternoon and heard from all of our panelists and some of the excellent questions is that how we answer those questions will, to a large degree, determine what kind of world our children and grandchildren are going to live in. I certainly don't pretend to have all the answers. Only Dr. Pillsbury has all the answers. But God help you. No, it's very sobering and very chastening, and also very encouraging because of the power and the creativity and the commitment of our partners, both our allies and our partners in Japan and India, that this arc of freedom that constitutes our Indo-Pacific is the greatest bulwark against threats to freedom from wherever they may come. We're talking about numbers. We've heard the number 650 million people, excluding India. If you throw India in there together, it's well over. It's close to 3 billion people who live in free, democratic or increasingly democratic countries, and that has to be a source of encouragement.
Well, to the very specific question of collaboration and cooperation, even if there is no UN charter, but US, Japan, India could have a confidence-building measure in the cyberspace. Sorry, and I think the time for that has come. And that rule, China will have to make sure that they abide by it, because democracies will probably, once you make the rule, you sorry, you sorry, just once you make the rule, then democracies will by and large stick to it. Why it is difficult for China to write its rule book? The number of hackers is more than 1 million. Majority of them are state funded through some organizations on the name of cyber technical education of the various provinces that they have. And they're, as I said, the loose term is they're footloose people. Many times the organization, the head doesn't know what is happening. So therefore, it is a difficult area, emerging area, and I don't know what all will be put in those rule books, but surely respecting the IPRs, the areas in which free flow of communication is required, and the areas where there are red lines. So these red lines, should be very well defined. Otherwise, China can turn around and say, okay, you told us to protect this, but you never talked about the, don't do this. They can sort of start splitting hair. So I think that, as he says, it's a new area. Just coming back to one question of yours, somebody mentioned about US and Vietnam friendship, collaboration. The one person who, to my mind, who contributed a great deal is the late Senator John McCain. He was a POW for 4 years. He's a US Navy pilot, so that makes 2 of us. But he ejected over Vietnam and he was there for 4 years, and I didn't. So that day we had an India-Ocean Conference of India Foundation in Hanoi in the month of September. And apart from our foreign minister, the deputy prime minister of Vietnam, who's also a foreign minister, he was also invited to make a keynote address, and he was late. So first thing that he came when he spoke his keynote address, he said, I'm sorry for the delay, but we have lost a very good friend in US. And he mentioned John McCain had just passed away. And he had gone to put a wreath on his bust, which is actually in Da Nang City. In Hanoi. He went to that, and there's a photograph of his flashed on the TV screens. So that much is the respect for that person who was actually a POW there, and he subsequently contributed a great deal. So I think they're at heart they are very much very sensitive about the relationship. Yes.
So I'll close with 4 quick comments, sort of skipping across comments from different people who made here. The first. I thought it was very interesting the way Secretary General Kanehara began with the American civil rights movement and the impact that had on American credibility and influence outside, which I think shows how seamless these issues are that have been talked about here, the social, the political, the economic, and the military. And if these are going to be wound together into meeting the challenge that he set of sustaining and expanding the liberal world order, it's going to take close cooperation among these 3 powers, these 3 major powers for the region. And secondly, that such a code of conduct as has been proposed, which would violate these longstanding norms, should not just be acquiesced to, that this is something that if people are serious about it, if these 3 powers are serious about it, they're going to have to push back on it. As Ronald Reagan used to say, To preserve freedom is the issue for every generation. A third point is how important this will be with cooperation with the countries of the region. That this is not just something to be done at one level, it's to be done throughout the region, and all three countries have been working on that. And finally, a theme that I believe Special Advisor Rose made, which is the importance of realism, both on the analysis of the problem and on addressing the problem, which I think he referred to as effective response. That it's, we're not often accused in think tanks of caring about whether something is effective or not. But in this case, it's quite important that these three countries work together effectively and that their responses be effective for this enormous challenge that's been laid out. So with that, I want to thank our three speakers for a terrific job, our two guest speakers for a terrific job, and Dr. Herman for kicking it off.